FutureDad 17. Britain is already socialist. Socialism is resentment disguised as compassion, enforced by tyranny disguised as tolerance. Anonymous. This essay, written in 2025, explores the question of whether or not my once beloved nation is already socialist. The title suggests it's a foregone conclusion, and anecdotally it certainly seems to be headed that way, and has been since the days of Clement Attlee. However, if we intend to use quantifiable metrics and deductive reasoning, we cannot really know in advance if we've reached socialism or not. I aim to find out here. So first I will describe my rationale for the main approach. Then I will go through the evidence step by step, as I initially found it. And I will let the numbers and logic do most of the talking. So let's begin. To determine if Britain is already socialist or not, it seems reasonable that it would have to meet commonly acceptable and quantifiable objective standards. I will split these into A and B. A is practical, the size of the state, and B is more conceptual, Marx's 10 planks of communism. Together that means that it is measured against 11 metrics. If that seems a small number, it's worth pointing out that the former, the size of the state, is the wellspring from which almost every socialist outcome is generated. So it stands out in a distinct, very influential category of its own. Where is all that money going if it's not to execute on the demands of state socialism? The latter test, whilst conceptual, is comprised of 10 simple, identifiable parts, each calibrated in accordance with the reality on the ground. To conclude, a reasonably conservative standard is that it has to meet both practical and conceptual standards, with the latter, Marx's 10 planks, being a majority threshold. A. The practical test, size of the state. The more detailed premise of this practical test is, since socialism deigns to run a country according to its own diktats, and not via individual actions in a free market economy, we need to know the proportion of the country's income that it burns to fuel it. This tells us the size of the real-world cost of state management and therefore, by implication, the scale of the meddling in private activities, and thus also the crowding out of private enterprise. This gives us a simple measure of how much it interferes with and governs people's lives, the degree of socialist control. The running cost of Britain is a non-trivial question to answer. How does one accurately measure the size of the state without becoming unnecessarily forensic and precise about it? There are thousands of government-funded projects and hundreds of thousands of state employees, not to mention expenditures which happily chug along without people to administer or track them. Do we, for example, count the recent electricity bill of all the government offices in Lincolnshire? What about expenses filled by employees of each office? Across every council office in the UK? Thankfully, no, we don't need to get to that handle on the size of the state. Fortunately, we have a sword for the Gordian knot, one which is painfully well known to anyone subject to it: taxation. The average weekly earnings in the UK were £673 in 2023. This is subject to an income tax of £4,475 per year, which works out at 12.81% of the average person's annual salary. This seems reasonably non-socialist so far. Even the famously uber-capitalist Hong Kong has a standard tax rate higher than this, 15 to 17.5%. Maybe the UK government isn't socialist at all. That tax pays for the police on the streets and the military to, theoretically, but unfortunately not in practice, defend the border. But that is merely income tax. What about VAT, which covers almost everything you see in a shop? The Office of Budget Responsibility calculates this at £6,000 per household in 2024. Just as I was about to convert this to a per-person estimate, I happened upon a long list of taxes that I naively hadn't considered. Fuel duty, insurance premium tax, climate change levy, and so on. Thankfully, I also settled on a more elegant and comprehensive way to compute the total tax burden. I used the government's Tax Lab site. It provides a total tax revenue of $950 billion in 2023. This is 37.5% of the UK GDP, which was $2,535 billion in 2023. 37.5%. The UK government seizes 37.5% of the labour, time, wealth, income and sweat of the nation, mostly by force, i.e. under the threat of prison for non-compliance. It is paid for directly through income and other taxes, or indirectly by sales-related taxes, which makes everything more expensive, but you can at least say it's quasi-voluntary. Note that 37.5% is an aggregate figure. It is the financial burden of government on the nation as a whole. High earners, say the top 10% wealthy, pay upwards of 60% in tax, or other involuntary payments on their income, an eye-watering tax burden on those unlucky enough to be successful and hard-working in the UK, considering what they get for it. In the West as a whole, the successful bear the burden of the government's redistributive largesse. 61% of Americans paid no federal taxes in 2020. So what does this mean? It means we on average work until about 3:40 p.m. on the Tuesday just so the government gets its share. Does that seem like freedom or the road to serfdom? If you saw that 37.5% of a loaf of bread was mouldy, would you keep it or throw the whole thing out? Any sane, non-desperate person would bin it. Another way to think of it, 37.5% of the electorate is enough to win the general election in the UK. In fact, it's 4% higher than the voting share of Labour, a party intent on pushing that tax rate as high as possible. 37.5%. Remember that figure. This should come to mind every commute to work, every bill you pay, and every item you buy with the money that's left. Only a crooked, bloated, gluttonous, feckless, reckless, malignant state could steal that much wealth from a nation and still pretend to be there to help. Verdict of A, practical test of socialism, pass. B, the conceptual test, Karl Marx's 10 planks. Now for the conceptual test. Has Britain achieved the majority of Karl Marx's 10 steps from socialism to communism? One could reasonably argue that even just one step of these 10 puts it on the path to communism and therefore socialist. In fact, Ayn Rand would argue this on the basis that only one drop of poison makes the water undrinkable. I will be very charitable instead. I will make the allowance that a country only passes a conceptual test if it meets not one but the majority of the 10 steps of Marx. That means 6. So here they are. Marx's 10 planks of communism. Abolish private property. I had to obtain permission from my local council to let out my apartment, so we are definitely heading there. But, to be very charitable, we are not there yet. Verdict, fail, 0 out of 1. 2. High progressive income tax. This is best demonstrated by the marginal tax rate, whereby for every pound you earn between 100k and 125k, you pay 62% tax due to incremental loss of the personal tax allowance. In other words, you are grossly financially penalised for being successful. Verdict, pass, 1 out of 2. 3. Abolish inheritance. We are not quite there yet, but getting close, as seen by the 2024 attempt to increase inheritance tax on farmers. The government, both cheeks, makes it so onerous to leave anything to your children that it is far better to squander it in advance. Note that Labour Prime Minister Keir Starmer's pension is protected by a special Act of Parliament, making him exempt from paying tax above £1 million of pension savings, unlike the general public. Just an aside. Verdict: fail, 1 out of 3. 4. Confiscate private property. Every property in the UK is subject to a tax called council tax. If you do not pay it, then the home may be seized from you and sold to generate funds for that council. UK councils are listed on Dun & Bradstreet as corporations. There is no such thing as freedom that is contingent on paying tithe to a third party. Verdict: pass, 2 out of 4. 5. Centralised credit and banks. Already in place. On the Bank of England's own website, quote, "We set the bank rate to influence other interest rates." The Monetary Policy Committee was bestowed with this power by the newly elected Labour government in 1997. Verdict: pass, 3 out of 5. Number 6. Control of communication, transportation, media. Whenever it matters, the government's message is signal boosted by the media. Meanwhile, opposing or alternate views are categorically squashed. Whether it's terrorist incidents like the Southport child massacre, the Pakistani Muslim rape gangs, COVID lockdowns, COVID vaccines, the Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, or rubbing their noses in diversity, it's the same game plan. The government consistently, unapologetically, and egregiously lies, misleads, and misdirects through their communications arm, the mainstream media. They make no apology for it. Dame Caroline Dinenage, chair of the House of Commons Media Committee, wrote to social media companies to censor popular media figure and podcaster Russell Brand. Also, when it matters, the government will stop or close transportation, such as again during COVID lockdowns, permanently as part of ULEZ, and of course 15-minute cities. I cover this topic in more detail in FutureDad 11, Why Government is So Dangerous, FutureDad 18, COVID Part 2, Lockdowns Were an Attempted Communist Revolution, and FutureDad 35, COVID Part 3, The Lies of Lockdown, LOL. Verdict: pass, 4 out of 6. Number 7. Remove private ownership of factories and business. There is no evidence that this has been done, but the pressure is there. This will follow the Chinese model where businesses have to pledge, financially or otherwise, fealty to the local commissar to do business. See the persecution of Jack Ma, creator of Alibaba. Verdict: fail, 4 out of 7. Number 8. Everyone paid the same except elites. There is evidence this is happening already, called managerial socialism by the economic commentator Dan Tubb, but it is incomplete. This may be one of the last planks to be achieved, but luckily, and unluckily for Britain, most successful people with means would have fled the country by then. Verdict: fail, 4 out of 8. 9. Monopolise and subsidise agriculture and industry. Already in effect. Under the guise of sustainable farming and stability, quotes, "The first sustainable farming incentive agreements for 2024 are now live as the government starts to deliver on its commitment to restore stability for the farming sector by continuing the controlled rollout of the scheme." Recall that all government terminology is the opposite or a twisted meaning of that which is declared. Restore stability simply means control. Verdict: pass, 5 out of 9. 10. Control socialist indoctrination in school. In effect, for decades, public school teachers are government workers. They propagate woke, egalitarian talking points, but never teach about taxation, government and media propaganda, or the dangers of inflation. Verdict: pass, 6 out of 10. Verdict of B, conceptual test of socialism, pass. So for both demonstrable and clear practical and conceptual reasons, I conclude that the United Kingdom is already a socialist country. FutureDad.